In this video, we're going to be thinking about whether the Gospels misquote Jesus. We're going to look at some of these related topics in coming weeks, so if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the channel and you'll receive updates when new videos come out. Now, if we want to know about Jesus Christ, we need reliable sources of information. So in this talk, we're going to evaluate the sources we have and give you 7 reasons why we think they can be trusted. Now, historical sources from 2,000 years ago are hard to come by. There's a handful of non-Christian sources that mention Jesus, but really we're reliant on the 4 Gospels that are found in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It might be tempting to dismiss them. After all, they were written by people who believed Jesus was the Son of God, so they can hardly be described as neutral. And yet, in other areas of life, we're often happy to read the work of enthusiasts, people who have first-hand experience of a topic, because we know they will have insights we can't get elsewhere. And so it's not unreasonable to do the same for those who claim to have known Jesus firsthand. Sometimes it's claimed that the Gospels we have today have been substantially altered by the process of transcription and translation. But actually, they were written in Greek. We have the Greek text today, and if you're reading a Gospel in English, it will have been translated directly from that Greek text. And we can be pretty sure that the text we have today is substantially the same as the original. There's enough manuscript evidence, some of which is pretty early, for us to have confidence that any variations that have arisen are minor. Now, that's all very well, but what if the Gospels weren't actually written until a long time after Jesus lived? Well, again, there's a great deal of scholarly consensus that at the least some of the Gospels were written while Jesus' first disciples were still alive. And by scholarly consensus, we're not talking about Christian scholars, who again might be a bit biased, but for example, the agnostic scholar Barter Ehrman, who says that Matthew was written around 80 to 85, Mark 65 to 70, Luke 80 to 85, and John the year 95. Why is that important? Well, it opens the possibility of the Gospels being written by people who knew Jesus personally, or at least were able to speak to other people who knew Jesus. And that also means that if the Gospel writers included information that was incorrect, it could have easily been refuted by people at the time. Now, we might still feel that 40 or 50 years is a long time to pass between events happening and the earliest records of them. Would someone writing today accurately describe the events of the Vietnam War or the Watergate scandal of the 70s? Well, we would be able to tell based on the details they gave. So let's test the Gospel writers in this. First of all, geography. In total, the Gospels mention 26 settlements, ranging from small villages to the city of Jerusalem. They include other geographical details, including seas, rivers, roads, and what they say about them matches the topography. Travelling to Jerusalem is described as going up. Travelling to Capernaum from either Cana or Nazareth is described as going down. And that fits the geography, just as we'd expect if people wrote about towns and villages that they knew well. Something else the writers got correct is people's names. In the English-speaking world, we know that certain names are more common in different countries and regions. Patrick's and Bernadette's are more common in Ireland, whereas a couple called Yayan and Caris almost certainly have Welsh roots. And it was the same among the Jews of the ancient world. Common names in Italy or Egypt were quite different to those in Palestine. And yet the characters in the Gospels have names typical of first century Palestinian Jews. And there are other details that fit together, which we only notice when we piece information together from several of the Gospels. Here's an example. One of the most famous miracles of Jesus is the feeding of 5,000 people by multiplying 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Luke tells us that the miracle took place near the village of Bethsaida. And John tells us that Jesus asked Philip about buying bread for the people. Now, on their own, these might seem like insignificant details until we remember that elsewhere in the Gospels we're told that Philip came from Bethsaida. So this is Jesus talking to a local man about where to get food. John tells us that the bread that they ate was made from barley and that the people sat on the grass. And these kind of details hardly seem important to the story, but they are entirely consistent with what John also tells us, which is that this happened at the time of the Passover festival, which comes at the end of a period of high rainfall where there's green grass, but the fact it's the end of that period, presumably dry enough to sit on. And it comes just after the barley harvest, which is why they're eating barley loaves. So we've got different authors telling a story that fits the setting precisely. So at this point, we might be able to conclude the Gospels we have today are books written 2,000 years ago by people who lived in Palestine or had direct access to people who did. All well and good. But how do we know that they describe Jesus and his teaching accurately? Well, the Gospel accounts of Jesus' teaching are consistent with one another. What do I mean by that? Well, firstly, the Gospel records agree with one another about what Jesus said and did. We don't find Jesus saying one thing in Matthew and then something completely opposite in Luke, notwithstanding the fact that different Gospels focus on different aspects of Jesus' teaching. But more importantly, across all 4 Gospels, a consistent picture of what Jesus taught emerges, not only in content, but also in the structures used. That's not something we'd expect if these were a set of fictional stories cobbled together from different authors or teachers. Let me give you an example. The parables of Jesus. These are short, pithy stories with a message, and they're a particular feature of Jesus' teaching. They work as standalone stories, but there are also connections and parallels between them. Similar opening or closing phrases, repeated imagery or themes, a feature whereby there are male and female pairs of characters, and back-to-back stories which refer to and complement one another. So this is all evidence of a common mind, that these stories were created by one person. Now, on the surface, maybe a lot of Jesus' teaching seems straightforward. After all, it's formed the basis of many a Sunday school lesson or school assembly. But let's not be blind to the masterful way these stories and these teachings are constructed. These aren't a bunch of half-remembered folk tales. They're complex. Think, for example, of the parable of the lost sons, which is found in Luke chapter 15. It's the story of 2 brothers and their relationship with their father. One of them leaves his father's house to go into the world, but eventually returns. The other stays at home, but apparently harbours a growing resentment towards his father. This parable talks about family dynamics, money, authority, jealousy, anger, greed, shame, and love. It addresses the cultural and religious context of the time. The rules-based religion of the Pharisees, the love of money and power of the Sadducees, the disillusioned masses oppressed by the religious leadership. It shows us God as a father who loves his children. And it does all of that in 400 words. When we dig deeper, we find evidence of even greater skill and understanding. That parable of the lost sons alludes to a whole host of instances in the Old Testament, the books of the Bible that were available in the time of Jesus. And these allusions extend to individual words and phrases that would imply the author of the story knew the specific words of the Old Testament. And that, that was no mean feat in an age when books were handwritten on huge scrolls and education was minimal for the majority of people. But this teacher in the Gospels is able to take the stories of Esau and Jacob, of Laban and Jacob, of Judah and Joseph, the story of Abraham, the story of Cain and Abel. He's able to take the themes and language and weave them into a parable that would take just a few minutes to recite. And this doesn't just happen in one parable. It's a feature of Jesus' teaching in the Gospels. This isn't something you could fake. Whether or not we trust the fact the Gospel writers attribute them to Jesus, it's pretty inescapable that whoever the author of these stories was, he was a skilled teacher and a storyteller who knew the Old Testament inside out. Now, not only did this teacher know the Old Testament, he also knew the religious culture of the time and place that the Gospels are set in. For example, Jesus wasn't the only person at the time to speak in parables. The fact that he's using them alludes to what was happening around him. The rabbis, the Jewish religious leaders in Palestine, also use parables, and they have parallels with those of Jesus. Some of the themes and imagery overlap, but the teacher in the Gospels, Jesus, takes things to a whole new level. Likewise with the scribes, the people whose job it was to write out the Old Testament scriptures. In the Jewish world, this was a very prestigious job requiring extensive training. Carefully copying of the text by hand would lead to a deep familiarity with the text. And Jesus shows intimate knowledge of this process by alluding to specific words and phrases in the Old Testament, which would only really be picked up by the scribes that knew things at that level of detail. And the Gospel writers point us towards that. They often state that the scribes and religious leaders were in Jesus' audience. And when we look at what we know of those people, we can see how precisely Jesus' teaching is crafted to target that audience. So let's put this all together. We've got 4 Gospels written by 4 different people and at different times. They present a consistent picture of Jesus and an accurate account of time and place that they describe. And they record the teaching of an individual who was incredibly familiar with the Old Testament scriptures and also with the details of the religious environment of the time and place the Gospels are set in, despite apparently not being part of the religious establishment. So, these Gospels and the teaching that they contain have the hallmark of authenticity, of being real records of the real teaching of a real man, an amazing teacher that the Gospels call Jesus of Nazareth. Now, we've just scratched the surface, and there's lots of information out there on the things we've covered. I'd particularly recommend 2 books by the Christian scholar Peter Williams, Can We Trust the Gospels? And The Surprising Genius of Jesus. These make the case for the Gospels being authentic historical accounts of Jesus and his teaching, and lots of what we've talked about in this video is explained in those books with much more evidence and detail. And there's lots more to learn about the Gospels. Feel free to post questions in the comments below or check out other videos on our channel for more information. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to receive updates about future videos.